Hello, everybody. This is essayette number 6. It's called Creation and Interpretation. It's a fairly long one, both the essayette itself and my responses to some of the questions that were asked. So here we go. Creation and interpretation. Of all the terms under discussion here, these are among the most treacherous. Because it is hard to define the processes they stand for, they pose semantic problems in any context and are easy targets for philosophic or linguistic challenge. And because they can confer dignity, these words are much abused by those wanting the same. This is especially true in any nominally creative or intellectual field where creation and interpretation are by definition supposedly taking place, to say nothing of the creative industries, unquote, where artistic processes are turned to non-artistic purposes, but the hired hands are as much in need of self-esteem as anyone else. And I had a little question wanting to add a little bit to that. And yeah, I can see how it might profit from some elucidation. We use this word creative in loose and sometimes self-serving ways, I think. What deserves the appellation? After all, exactly one of my points here, there's a creative element in many of our activities, and who's to discriminate among them? For myself, I distinguish between what we might call creation for creation's sake and creation undertaken towards some other end. When an artist seeks to create a work, to bring it forth from his or her imagination in response to an impulse and some thought, and the work itself is the point. That's being creative in what I think of as the highest sense. Its objective is to add to the pool of works that try to express truths and beauties of the world to the rest of us. Or, when an artist agrees to create a work according to certain specifications, to, let us say, design a museum or a public monument, or a piece of music in commemoration of some great person's death, or a mural in celebration of some important national achievement, that is creation in the service of what we perceive as a public good. It accepts limitations on the artist's free creativity, and it could be misdirected toward a political or ethically questionable purpose, but usually its intention is to benefit society, and it often inspires responses of artistic value independent of its civic purpose. So I don't have to wrestle with myself to consider these works creative. But then, we have potential creative talents put to very different uses. I'll give you a personal example. I worked for a time as associate editor on a flossy trade magazine in the advertising business. This was in the Mad Men era, exactly to the year. One of my assignments was to write a profile of the CEO of one of the big ad agencies. And by definition, the profile had to be generally flattering. So there was already creativity involved in that. Though of course, he had some likable and admirable qualities. The executive liked my writing, or maybe just the flattery, I don't know, and offered me a job as copy group chief, a very good position for someone just starting in the business, and for twice the money I was earning over at the mag. So I toured the offices with him and met a number of the people I would have been working with. And there is no question that someone taking that job and succeeding in it would need to be creative in a restricted but real sense. Colleagues would have said of me, he's in creative. And I could have explained to people at parties, no, I'm on the creative side. But the creativity involved is now so restricted by the requirement of selling a product and of distorting whatever truths and beauties might fortuitously be involved in ways necessary to that end, that the word creative, which bestows a dignity on a function that people at the party might otherwise look on askance, and we all have need of dignity, self-respect, to think of ourselves as contributing has lost any real meaning. Back to the essayette. Only people can be creative. Creativity is not a property innate in any mode of activity, including those named creative. The same is true of interpretivity. Furthermore, in the performance arts, creation and interpretation are so overlapped that it is hard to confidently mark a boundary between them. Can any act or process of performance art be defined as creative and not interpretive, or the other way around? Even the purest strokes of authorial imagination are interpretive. They select objects from the potentially infinite field of self-consciousness as worthy of attention. Such selection is itself an interpretation. And there is no interpretive moment that is not also a creative opportunity. For although the presence of authorial instructions limits the interpreter's field in important ways, the range of response to any instruction or sequence of instructions is still broad. And there's a question here that Jennifer has asked 2 or 3 times in different contexts relating to this range of interpretation within the bounds set by the creator. And I'm postponing some of it until we talk about acting itself in a couple of times, or at the end of the next essayette where that question comes up again. So I'm skipping that for the moment, but I will get back to it. A successful performance encounter is one in which performer and receptor forge the crucial link in a chain that stretches from the first spark of authorial imagination into the residue of meaning in the receptor's life and being. Experientially, the striking of the creative interpretive spark is poorly described by the word selection, since at whatever point it occurs, it has the quality of something that presents itself to the participant. It takes leaps across gaps in the rational sequence, or else seems to bypass it or precede it. We feel it as intuitive, sometimes mystical. This only means, though, that selection is taking place at a deeper level than it does for common transactional purposes. We have different ways of describing the spark, depending upon its location in the creative interpretive chain. An author will think of it as an idea that comes to him, a performer as the moment of connection to the material, a critic as the flash of insight in the search for meaning, and a receptor as that strange but familiar birth of belief, often with some strong affect attached to it. These terms certainly describe different perspectives and different nuances of experience, but they refer to the same sorts of events and share a further similarity in state of being, involving raised levels of physiological excitation and receptivity at once. Nevertheless, words are not arbitrary symbols, and the mere persistence of creation and interpretation suggests that some distinction is being described. Such a distinction is surely implied by the hierarchy of our everyday thinking, wherein creative acts are assigned a higher position than interpretive ones. This has to do with the extent to which the field of choice has been narrowed through previous artistic intervention. An act of pure creation is one for which no pre-interpretation has taken place. The creative artist selects from an infinite field, restricted only by the limits of his own responsive and inventive capacities, and by those primary choices of the medium in which he has decided to work, and the techniques, tools, and materials with which he will carry it out. The creator's process begins as an interior dialogue, a wrestling with inner objects to find an expressive form. This impels a first creative step. For operatic creators, the step may be a line of prose or poetry, a musical phrase or motif, or a fragment that combines these elements. It will be imagined as spoken or sung or played, perhaps even first expressed that way, but then it will be inscribed. This expression and inscription, the end of one creative process, is the beginning of another. A unit of aesthetic material is now outside its creator, where it behaves quite differently than it did inside. The creator takes it in sensorially and responds accordingly, as would any other reader. He becomes its receptor, interpreter, and critic. As interpreter and critic, the creator remains at liberty to alter or expunge the now expressed object, or to recapture it for further inner consideration. But with inscription, a line is crossed, a commitment made. A bias now exists to let the object stand and to move forward. And I have a question from Steve here, who is interested in an example of creators' interior dialogue. Sure. And Steve mentions Beethoven's sketchbooks, which are good examples of a part of that process, scratching down your ideas in fragments to be recalled and developed, or critiqued, or reconsidered. So there it is, in front of you now. It's out in the world. And while you can scratch it up, or give it up on figuring out how you're going to use it, it is one of your babies now. And there's a pull toward letting it live. But interior dialogue is the movement inside you that produces the sketchbook before any of the ideas escape onto the paper and sit there looking at you. Since I have no access to anyone's interior dialogue, let alone Beethoven's, I can vouch only for my own. And since, except for a few songs I wrote for insertion into a play, I've never been a composer or a poet, I must look for an analogous example from my prose. Further, although critical writing does involve creativity, see above, it is not creative in the full imaginative sense I described earlier. So I'll have to look for something in a work of fiction. Fortunately, I did write a novel. It's called O Paradiso. And it was published by Arbor House William Morrow in 1988. I love that cover. The woman who did this, that William Morrow, exactly caught the kind of faded romantic spirit and the satirical tone that's in the book. It's really a great job. The novel's about an ambitious, ramshackle conceptualist production of Meyerbeer's L'Africana at the Beacon Theater over here on the Upper West Side, with an overlapping subplot about fanatical rare record collectors scheming for access to the legendary collection of a record pirate king everyone knows is dying. So it has a large cast of characters covering all those connected to these enterprises. But the central ones are Carl, a sort of rumbustious voice teacher, reasonably successful, but full of resentments and biases under a hearty exterior, and Gerald, a mild-mannered newspaper critic with his own backlog of disappointments and frustrations. Carl is straight, Gerald is gay, and they have distinctly different temperaments and POVs. Yet, they are both American men of the same generation, and they share a great personal and professional devotion to opera, to art. And though the lower rungs of the opera business is the novel's milieu, it's using that to chronicle the declining status of the educated white American male and his culture, and how these two are dealing with that. Not too well. In the essayette, I'm talking about the craft of creation, the process of deciding where to start, and then what words or notes to get down first, and then what follows from that, and insisting that with each word or note, all others are foreclosed, and you must now continue along a path that started with that first inscription, discovering your work, and that is really what happens as you go. Doesn't mean you can't revise, but that instinct to let the baby live grows ever stronger as you begin to see where you're going and what occurs along the way. But with all due honor to the importance of craft, which is how the thing gets done. I'd like to emphasize, just as I said last time, of all of us receptors weaving the meaning of an artistic encounter into our entire lives and beings, creation also comes out of the entire life and being of the creator. And this interior dialogue, really the germ of the new work, comes from somewhere in the creator that has emotional significance. It's brought out of the creator's spirit before craft gets involved. And the inner dialogue takes place at that spiritual level. One oddity of my novel is that the ending was written first. Then, knowing what my destination was, but very little else, I searched for a beginning that would point toward it. And I'll try to show you how this emotional, spiritual, psychological, if you like, stirring sort of kickstarts the creative process and gives rise to the craft, to invention and technique. This brief final chapter is set on the morning after the first night of the great production and the opening night party. As it happens, it's the morning of Memorial Day. And here's how that choice came about. My wife and I had recently returned from a vacation down in the Caribbean, including a crossing by catamaran from St. Martin over to St. Bart's. And I was turning over vague thoughts about a story or novel with the atmosphere of the Caribbean and being on a watercraft of some modest sort in the Caribbean, figuring into it. I got up rather late that morning and went over to an open window to see what sort of day it was, warm for May, as they say, and very quiet. Now you should understand, for what may seem like digressions, I'm sorry for that, but they're necessary for context, for what in fact they are what we mean by context. That the early 1980s was not the happiest of times on Manhattan's Upper West Side. We were less than a decade removed from the Vietnam debacle and everything that went with it, including the bitter conflicts of attitude toward the military. The crack epidemic was raging. The AIDS epidemic was in its early stages. The city as a whole was by no means fully recovered from the bankruptcy of the 1970s, and the neighborhood's rather shabby but rich culture, which was basically that of the World War II European Jewish emigre generation, was slowly but surely dying. The window I was at faced south, just a few blocks down past the Beacon and the Ansonia to Verdi Square, which was at the time known for good reason as Needle Park. As I stood there, still half asleep, the sound of a marching band playing the Sousa March came drifting up on the breeze down there. And I remembered that it was Memorial Day. And here was this sound from the world of my childhood, sounds of patriotic celebrations, screened off for a long time now by everything that had happened since. A little later, I went down to the square. The band was gone, but there was a veteran in uniform there, VFW, I suppose, selling poppies. The poppies of Flanders Fields, in memory of those who fought and were either buried there or lived on, as veterans had done every year on this day since the armistice of World War I. He held out a poppy toward me. I looked at him with very strong, ambivalent feelings and bought a poppy. For a moment, I felt a great rush of affection for him. He gave me a salute and said, "Semper Fi, buddy," which probably made him a Marine, and I returned the salute, and he moved on. I stood there for a few moments, taking in the square with the statue of Verdi and 4 of his characters, and therefore opera, and the Beacon with its history, and the Ansonia Hotel with its history, and the history of our country with its wars and of our city with its struggles, and my own history with all of these. And I realized that all this and the powerful feelings that went with it would somehow go into the mix with the Caribbean and with opera, but I had no idea how. So after a few days or weeks, I can't recall exactly how long, of interior dialogue, which was basically an internal churning in search of a form, I wrote this last scene, which I knew would be the end of the book. All right, so what I'll do is I'll read the final lines of that scene, the very end of the book, and then I'll turn back and read the first few lines from the opening of the book. What's necessary to understand here, at the end, is that the stories of Carl and Gerald have remained separate throughout the novel. Though they are both connected to the central event, two of Carl's students are in the production, and Gerald has written an essay for the program booklet and is now reviewing it for his newspaper, and they know of each other. They don't meet until the night of the opening, and then only briefly, until they escape the party together, Gerald because he wants to avoid certain people, and Carl because he's gone off on a loud rant filled with racist and homophobic slurs and has made himself persona non grata. Now they are each out on a morning errand and have spotted each other. Gerald under the marquee of the Beacon and Carl diagonally across the street. There's other stuff leading up to this, of course, which sets a mood. And as you'll see, my interior dialogue is surely in there, but has given way to craft, because many things have had to be decided on in a highly selective way to bring these characters to this end point. The chapter is called Memorial Day, and here is how it concludes. Just a second to find the page. Here we are. For another moment, Gerald and Carl regard each other from their respective corners across the fences and benches of the mall. They peek at each other around the cop and the car he now signals on through. Finally, Carl grins and nods crisply, and Gerald waves weakly once more, smiling a trace of a smile. Then they step along. Carl downtown to the hardware in search of his doorknob, and Gerald uptown to Zabar's for a pound of Jamaica Blue Mountain. As you will have noticed, there's recognition, friendly enough, but still an apartness, a gap. No resolution, really. Okay, now I'll read the opening paragraph, plus 2 more lines of the novel. This first chapter is called Simmy. His heart kicking against the inside of his bony little chest, Simmy half runs up the crumpled sidewalk toward Fifth Avenue. He hates this part of Brooklyn. When he'd first known Dr. R.T., it had been all right, but now it's all black and Spanish, and he hates coming here. Simmy stumbles on the edges of jumbled slate and cement. He's scared and, of course, upset right now, and he just wants to get to that phone booth and the lights along Fifth. He reaches the booth. Its glass lies showered like spilled rock candy on the busted up curb, but the phone is working. He hears the tone. So as you see, hope I didn't overact there. As you see, I haven't started with Carl or Gerald, but with one of the supporting characters. I think that just felt right, and the reader soon realizes that Simmy isn't one of the leads. It quickly shifts away. So it kind of tells the reader that we have backed in through the subplot and that there will be an obliqueness and an episodic feel to how the story will be told, which I think fits the uneasy sense of solid ground giving way under the world these people occupy. For your information, Dr. R.T. is the great dying collector and pirate, and Simmy is his longtime assistant and, we assume, lover. And he's trying to reach that phone booth to call another supporting character from the circle of collectors, the Reverend Wally, for help with handling Dr. R.T.'s demise and the perilous state of his coveted collection. I hope this has given a good idea of what I mean by interior dialogue and how it relates to the craft of creation. I think it has to have a close parallel to how operas are generated. For several summers, my wife, Molly Regan, directed and taught in the Steppenwolf Theater School for actors and acting teachers. And one of the things she laid great stress on was the necessity of reading the play script with high alertness to even the most minute of the writer's choices, down to the individual word. These choices aren't casual, and they aren't general or improvisational. They are specific and inscribed. So pay attention. Okay, returning now to essayette number 6, at the point of noting that an inner object has been expressed by the creator, and there's a bias in favor of letting it stand. The expressed object has preempted a small portion of the previously infinite field, has begun to shape it and define its limits. It has become a first choice. And once assented to by the creator, it precludes all other choices. Nothing else may stand in its place, nothing proceed from it that does not take it into account. The incorporation and interaction with expressed objects will continue until the field is entirely defined, bound, and filled, at least insofar as the creator can envision it. That inscription is not an inevitable step in the development of performance is attested to by the oral traditions of cultures that have done without it. Indeed, this step marks a bifurcation of the creative and interpretive functions that have become a serious issue in the Western performance arts. It makes the creator a writer, and thus subject to all the questions about the nature of writing and of languages, all the challenges to the notion of authorship that are parts of the contemporary critical scene. So perhaps the uses of inscription are worth a moment's notice. The first is to keep track of a creator's discoveries, so as to remember and, if desired, repeat them. Inscription is imprecise, and many of these discoveries, indeed elaborate and subtle chains of them, can be remembered and repeated, possibly with greater imitative precision and interpretive force, without it. Which cannot? In music, those that involve complex interrelationships between the vertical and horizontal dimensions, together with the densities of harmonic and instrumental textures, and the extent and variety of structures that result from those interrelationships. Everything in the creative process described above, confirmed by the eye, everything that it flows from the compilation of the creator's inscriptions to form a text, and from the compilation of text to form a literature, which is in turn the reference for further creation. In other words, at the very least, everything since the advent of polyphony, and I've probably left out a few things. All those, everything I've listed, are parts of the things that inscription is useful for, that without inscription are difficult or even impossible to reproduce, to repeat. Now in opera, we have all these things, plus their interactions with verbal content and stage action. The division between creator and interpreter, forced by inscription, is a form of specialization. While creative imagination and performance expressivity are often found to some degree in the same person, they only rarely coexist at the highest level, and the technical perfection of each is usually best pursued independently. The compilation of the creator's inscriptions, the text, becomes the interpreter's point of departure. Selecting from the field bounded by the creator's decisions, he initiates his own process of selection and invention in his own medium, with his range of techniques. The critic or commentator commences his analytic task, also selective and inventive, from this new, twice interpreted point of departure. Indeed, the practical critics, and by that I mean the everyday reviewer, the person who's reviewing performances, the practical critic's steadiest employment lies in evaluating the tensions between the first and second layers of interpretation, that is, between text and performance. Finally, the receptor takes his step of incorporating the thrice interpreted material. And it is always thrice interpreted, for analysis is never bypassed, even when the receptor acts as his own critic. We might with some justice label the creator, the performer, the critic, and the receptor simply as first interpreter, second interpreter, third and fourth interpreters. And these terms will appear hereunder when emphasis on the interpretive function is intended. But this flattening out does not serve all purposes. There is a validity to our ranking of creation, interpretation, analysis, and incorporation, even as we concede that all these take place simultaneously and continuously up and down the encounter chain. For the first interpreter has done something the others have not. He has struck a spark on his foray into the potentially infinite field of phenomena and made something of it. Upon this something depend the selections and inventions of all subsequent interpreters. It is because delimited selections are the most vexing ones, and because the first interpreter has assumed the exhilarating but fearsome responsibility of making the first choice, that we at least loosely observe our hierarchical order along the encounter chain. It is also for this reason that we feel that interpretive artists, however gifted in their own right, have a degree of responsibility toward the results of the creator's work, by way of honoring the terms of the first choice. It is true that any of the interpreters may perform well or badly, creatively or not. Often there is more invention in a performance than in a text, or in a critique than in either. Indeed, receptors' acts of incorporation are sometimes the most ingeniously selective and inventive of any in the encounter chain. It is also true that honoring the terms of the first choice does not mean mere obedience to the instructions of the text. It means using the field defined by the text as the territory for creative exploration. Determining the boundaries of the field is one of the heaviest obligations of the interpretive artist, and currently the most contentious. But these observations do not alter the creator's status as first interpreter, or contradict the uniqueness of his function. In practice, all they mean is that it is a good idea for interpreters to closely inspect the field the creator has defined for their work, and for creators to be well attuned to the realities of the performer-receptor encounter, where the fate of their selections will be decided. First choices remain first choices, always, but in any performance art, they are conceived for the performer-receptor encounter, where the text becomes the work. And that will be the title of the next essayette in the next episode, The Text and the Work.